This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. So much of your personal info is out of your control, like your insurance provider that has your social security number and your favorite retailer that has your payment details. If they get breached, your information, your identity, is vulnerable. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
You hear those ads at the beginning of this podcast? If you don't want to ever hear those again, feel free to join us on Patreon, Supercast, or Apple subscriptions. Links will be in the show notes. Before we begin this episode, a little friend of mine would like to wish you something special. Okay. Say thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Explicit content is found in this episode, so listener discretion is advised.
Welcome back to True Crime Cases. I'm your host, Lainey. Insurance, as I'm sure we all know, is a pain in the neck. To get, to keep, to cash in every step of the way, it's as tedious as it is crucial. But that's exactly the issue. It is crucial. In a country where medical care and hospital bills are horrifyingly expensive, being hospitalized without insurance is a one-way trip to enormous amounts of debt. And hell, even with insurance, people find themselves in the red just for the sheer misfortune of falling sick. Unless you make a generous salary year over year, it always feels like you're one bout of illness away from never making up the cost. Obviously, this affects certain groups of people more than others. Kids can't pay for braces, they're supported by their parents who may or may not have dental coverage through their workplace. Unemployed people have next to no source of income and often resort to pretending they're not sick and just hoping that it doesn't get worse. And once you're retired, you have a limited pool of resources to take care of yourself, which is dangerous considering you're at the age where you're more likely to need care. This is where Medicare comes in. Their website tells us that Medicare is a health insurance program for people who are 65 or older, which is largely considered retirement age. And since retiring means that you no longer have access to any insurance provided by your workplace, many people who retire around the age of 65 have few places to turn. Medicare is often their best option and helps them to continue getting vital medical care after retirement. It isn't entirely age-based. If you have a disability, you may qualify for Medicare sooner, but it's decided on a case-by-case basis. As with everything meant to help people in need, though, there are those few people who wish to exploit the system for their own gain. People who are not actually the at-risk members of society lying, cheating, and stealing from those who truly need it. Fraudsters who lie through their teeth to get money or benefits they are not supposed to have, at the expense of countless individuals who actually need it. And as we're about to find out, it's not always so-called patients who are the ones committing the fraud. Okay, on to the show. Joyce Sharon Brannon was born at Decorah Memorial Hospital in Iowa on February 7, 1947, then spent the vast majority of her life in and around Chicago, Illinois. Joyce graduated from Crystal Lake Community High School in 1965, then continued her education at the Elgin Community College in 1969. She was a kind and loving person who always wanted to help others, so it was no surprise to anyone who knew her that she wanted to be a nurse. Following graduation, she got her wish and had the opportunity to work as a nurse at a number of hospitals in Chicago: Weiss Memorial Hospital, Columbus Hospital, and Forkosh Lincoln West Hospital, which is now Lincoln West Medical Center. Unfortunately, Joyce had severe asthma, which forced her to retire early, and also meant that she used canes and a wheelchair to get around. Thankfully, though, it wasn't just nursing that got Joyce through the day. Her religious faith was every bit as important to her life. She was a member of the Bethany Evangelical Lutheran Church in Chicago and following her early retirement, she began helping out at the church by doing odd jobs here and there. She then went on to become the church secretary. This propensity to keep taking on more and more responsibilities led Joyce being known fondly as the jack of all trades to anyone who attended the church's services and community events. She also sang in the church choir and organized and volunteered at daycare and gym games, which were activities for kids in the area. Joyce even lived in an apartment in the basement of the church, making it an incredibly accessible workplace for her. Due to Joyce's challenges with being mobile, she understandably encountered medical issues involving her feet. These issues worsened to the point that, for the sake of her health, Joyce was forced to become a patient of Dr. Ronald Mikos. Dr. Mikos was a 53-year-old podiatrist based in Chicago who performed routine medical procedures on his patients to improve their mobility and comfort, things like carefully trimming their toenails to avoid damage from overgrowth, something it is very hard for elderly and disabled individuals to do for themselves. This is where Medicare comes back into the story. Unfortunately, Medicare does not cover routine medical procedures, so Joyce had to pay out of pocket for her treatments. And Dr. Mikos didn't make much of a profit for his efforts, since he only undertook routine medical procedures. Dr. Mikos began turning in false claims to Medicare, stating he performed surgeries on patients, rather than the routine medical procedures he was actually carrying out. Unbeknownst to Joyce, Mikos had submitted a total of 87 claims to Medicare over the course of her treatment. In reality, he had only ever performed 2 minor surgeries on her feet. But the sheer number of claims Mikos was making on Joyce and a handful of other patients hadn't gone unnoticed. By 2002, the government had caught on to the scheme, and the FBI initiated an investigation into Dr. Mikos' practices. As part of this process, Dr. Mikos was being investigated by a federal grand jury for Medicare fraud. According to the Chicago Tribune, this investigation revealed that Mikos had billed Medicare over 600 surgeries for only 6 patients, one of which was Joyce Brannon. When interviewed by the authorities, Joyce was shocked to find out about the 87 claims and informed them that her entire treatment had only included those 2 minor surgeries. According to testimony from Mikos' secretary, who had been employed by him for 7 years, Mikos had never performed a single surgery while she was employed in his office. Somehow, Dr. Mikos learned of the Medicare investigation, and he started to panic. He immediately began pursuing 7 of his patients, asking them to submit affidavits stating he had performed a surgery on them. Or rather, he demanded they do so, as every instance he tried to acquire an affidavit for was false. Of those 7 he visited, it appeared that none of them testified in his defense. However, we do not know whether this was due to Mikos' persuasiveness or the mental and physical limitations of the patients themselves. You see, the 7 patients were all elderly individuals, and several of them were not mentally competent to submit affidavits. This didn't stop Mikos, though. If these patients did not agree to help him, he wrote false affidavits and signed their names himself. Or maybe I should say he forged them. According to the Chicago Tribune, Mikos even prepared scripts for his patients to read if the police came to question them about an alleged Medicare fraud situation. One script read, quote, "If they get too specific, you can tell them you do not remember." Another read, "Tell them he is a good doctor and that you are very satisfied and you have no complaints." Mikos was not only lying to the government, but manipulating, exploiting, and taking advantage of his elderly patients. Joyce was identified by the grand jury as one of these 7 patients and was subpoenaed to testify before the grand jury on January 31st, 2002. Mikos visited Joyce prior to the trial and tried to persuade her not to testify, pleading with her and saying it would ruin his practice and his family, but Joyce could not be swayed. She had been a medical professional herself, and the needle of her staunch moral compass could not be moved. She said she had to do what was right, and Mikos would just have to live with the consequences. Well, I wish I could say Joyce did just that, but devastatingly, she would never have the chance. On January 27, 2002, 54-year-old Joyce Brannon was found murdered in her apartment at the Northside Church. She had been shot in the head and back 6 times at close range. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing else in the apartment seemed to have been disturbed or stolen. Courthouse News reported that a witness said they saw a man with gray hair entering the church on the day of the murder. Now, put a pin in that for later. And yes, you heard that date right. The day she was murdered was only 4 days before she was to testify against Dr. Ronald Mikos in front of the grand jury. Coincidentally, the federal subpoena she had received regarding giving testimony was found close to her body. Due to the convenient timing of the murder, obviously, Mikos became the investigation's #1 suspect. He was initially charged with obstructing justice for allegedly attempting to stop Joyce and the other patients from testifying. However, U.S. Attorney Patrick J. Fitzgerald made it clear that additional charges may be coming because he was under investigation for Joyce's murder. According to court documents, as police began investigating the scene of the murder, they didn't find any shell casings, which indicated that a revolver was used to kill Joyce. No weapon was found, but the bullets they recovered from the scene sufficed to identify the gun. Investigators' analysis was able to determine the bullets came from a, quote, .22 long rifle rimfire, brass-coated rounds with solid round noses, concave bases, and multiple knurled cannulars. Each bullet had been fired from a barrel with 8 lands and grooves. The rifling had a right-hand twist. If you didn't manage to follow most of that, don't worry. Basically, all you need to know is that there were very specific impressions left on the bullets as they were loaded and fired, and any weapons the investigation came across in the future could be tested against these unique marks to determine whether it had been the smoking gun, as it were. Or rather, guns they already had their sights on, because police knew that Mikos had a gun that fit this description. How? 3 weeks before the murder, they were called to the home of Shirley King, a girlfriend of Mikos. While attending this call, they discovered that Mikos kept several firearms at Shirley's home. However, when they asked if Mikos had a firearm owner's identification or an FOID card, he said he did not. Therefore, police confiscated all the firearms, giving Mikos an inventory of all the weapons and ammunition, to be returned only upon Mikos renewing his FOID card. Mikos did so, then took his recently reacquired firearms to a storage unit. Following the murder of Joyce Brannon, police searched this storage unit on February 4, 2002, and were able to locate all his weapons, except for one, a Haas-Schmidt revolver. The Haas-Schmidt revolver shot long rifle ammunition. The police found a box of Remington .22 long rifle rim-fire brass-coated rounds with solid round noses, concave bases, and multiple knurled cannulars in Mikos's car. Does this description sound familiar? It should, because I've had to say it twice now, which I'll have to thank my writer for later. There were also 20 shells missing from the box, and the revolver itself was never found. However, there was one spent casing with a mark made by a hemisphere-shaped firing pin, and court documents state that a Haas-Schmidt revolver could have left such marks. Of course, there was more damning evidence to come in the investigation against Mikos. The FBI received cell tower records that detailed Mikos's movements leading up to Joyce's murder. These records showed that in the week before the murder, Mikos had used his phone in the area where Joyce lived on several occasions. The FBI also found handwritten notes in Mikos's car, which kept track of information about the Northside Church, where Joyce lived and spent much of her time. These notes contained information such as the church's operating hours, which could only be found listed inside the church. This indicated that not only was he in the area on multiple occasions leading up to her murder, but that he might have been inside the very same building as Joyce. They were also able to unearth details about the discussions Mikos was having with his patients regarding the Medicare case against him. All this considered, although they had not been able to locate the murder weapon, the FBI thought they had enough evidence to arrest Mikos. He was placed into custody on February 5, 2002. only 10 days after the murder occurred. According to court documents, the government filed a criminal complaint against Mikos the next day. They first charged him with knowingly using physical force with intent to influence or prevent testimony in an official proceeding. And on the same day, the grand jury returned an indictment with 25 charges including Medicare fraud, witness tampering, and the murder of Joyce Brannon. Later that year in November, additional charges that made the case eligible for the death penalty were approved by the grand jury. These included intentional killing of a grand jury witness, serious bodily injury resulting in death, and substantial premeditation to commit these acts. The trial of Ronald Mikos began in April 2005. His attorneys were John Beal and Cynthia Giacchetti. Beal was originally supposed to represent Mikos in his Medicare case, but decided to stay on for the murder trial, even though he had never tried a capital murder case before. Since Beal was so inexperienced, to ensure appropriate counsel was given, the court also appointed Cynthia Giacchetti, who did have experience in capital litigation, as his co-counsel. As stated earlier, the weapon that murdered Joyce could not be located. However, the government asked a ballistics expert, FBI Special Agent Paul Tangren, to testify. Tangren did a test where he fired a similar model revolver and reviewed rifling characteristics in an FBI database. These tests showed that Mikos' missing Hawes-Schmidt revolver could have possibly been the murder weapon. Not that it definitely was used to commit the murder, as a revolver would need to be present to prove that with any level of certainty, but that it could not be ruled out. Mikos' attorneys attempted to hire a rebuttal ballistic expert, but the court denied the request due to him being located outside of the region, which would entail a higher cost than a local witness. Mikos then hired his own expert, John Nixon, but his legal team chose not to call him to testify, as he was unable to provide evidence that would effectively challenge the government's findings. Now back to my pin from earlier. Do you remember the person seen going into the church with gray hair? Gray hair dye was found in Mikos' car during the investigation, alongside the notes recording church information and conversations with patients. Mikos was found guilty of all charges on May 5, 2005. And, as in many cases, Mikos' legal team appealed the decision. In an attempt to aid this appeal, they hired 3 experts in neurology, radiology, and psychiatry to testify regarding Mikos' mental state. The 3 experts identified several potential mental health disorders, including attention deficit disorder, multiple personality disorders, schizotypal personality disorder, and substance dependence. However, they could not reach a consensus on whether Mikos could definitively be diagnosed with any of these disorders. Oddly, Mikos' attorneys had not requested a hearing to assess his mental capacity to stand trial during the guilt or innocent phase. The government hired its own mental health expert that concluded that Mikos had only opioid and alcohol dependence, along with personality disorders, but no cognitive defects. According to court documents, Stacy Rosenfield, the mother of 2 of his children, was interviewed by the FBI regarding this. Stacy reported that around the time of the murder, Mikos' substance abuse issues had noticeably increased. However, this report was never given to the defense team. Despite this, Mikos' legal team still managed to indicate that Mikos had an alcohol abuse illness, which could have caused him to act inappropriately and be a factor for leniency in sentencing. Spark something uncommon this holiday with just the right gift from Uncommon Goods. Uncommon Goods takes the stress out of holiday shopping by curating remarkable hand-picked treasures all in one spot. One of my top picks is the Mushroom Cottage Air Fort. It's a magical mushroom-shaped play space for kids inflating in seconds with a simple box fan. Plus, it's big enough for grown-ups to join in on the fun and easy to stow away. When you shop Uncommon Goods, you're supporting artists and small businesses. Many of their items are handmade and everything is wonderfully unique. Definitely not the usual holiday lineup. And with each purchase, they give back $1 to a nonprofit partner of your choice. To get 15% off your next gift, go to uncommongoods.com/Lainey. That's uncommongoods.com/Lainey for 15% off. Uncommon Goods. They're all out of the ordinary. But leniency was not given. After less than 3 days of jury deliberation, on May 23, 2005, Mikos was recommended to be sentenced to death by a unanimous vote. This marked only the second time the federal court in Chicago had applied the death sentence. U.S. attorneys John Corcoran and Jeffrey Kramer argued that the sentence was suitable as, quote, an attack or murder of a federal witness was an attack on the justice system. In discussion with the Chicago Tribune, U.S. Attorney Patrick J. Fitzgerald called the murder of a federal witness unheard of in a Medicare fraud case and stated, when anything like this happens, we're going to be all over it. In 2006, Judge Guzman complied with the jury's recommendation of the death sentence for the capital murder charge. For the non-capital convictions, he sentenced Mikos on 15 counts which carry a prison term of 60 months served consecutively, and an additional 79 months for the remaining 9. On top of that, Mikos would have to pay a restitution charge of $1.8 million. Joseph C. Ways, the assistant special agent in charge of the Chicago FBI office, stated, if Dr. Mikos would have just taken the punishment for which he has been investigated for, he would be walking the streets today. He said, he would have been released probably with time served for the Medicare fraud that he'd committed. Unfortunately, he did not see it that way, and he decided to take matters into his own hands. Mikos' legal team weren't going to give up just yet, and they continued to appeal numerous aspects of his trial and sentencing. According to court documents, on August 25, 2008, the Seventh Circuit accepted Mikos' sentence, but vacated the restitution award and remanded for a further determination. Mikos petitioned for a rehearing, but the Supreme Court denied his request on October 5, 2009. Mikos filed a Section 2255 habeas petition in 2010, arguing that the court violated his rights during the trial. As part of this, he submitted reports referencing a new psychiatric diagnosis. Dr. Lisa Rohn formally diagnosed Mikos with bipolar disorder and stated Mikos had significant cognitive impairment as a result of both this disorder and his long-term substance abuse. It took many years for the parties to work through the discovery disputes. Since this was a capital murder charge, the court allows the person charged to present discovery facts that are relevant to his constitutional claims. So in 2020, Mikos presented the discovery findings to the court and asked them to intervene in his favor. According to court documents, Mikos cited 5 discoveries. The first was the trial exhibits and records in his murder case. Mikos believed these materials could help him in his claim and was entitled to this information as a matter of due process. The court agreed, stating that the government should allow access to his counsel for all trial exhibits and were allowed to copy the exhibits at a mutually convenient time and place. The second discovery was Mikos' substance abuse and medical history. Included in this request were records that could indicate early signs of mental illness or addiction. Stay with me here because this is going to be a lot of information. These records included his spending habits, observations from family friends, patients, and colleagues, family and counseling records concerning the mental health of Mikos' family, Mikos' behavior while in custody, and his professional performance as a podiatrist, including disciplinary matters. Mikos believed these records may have provided evidence that he was not competent to stand trial at the time of his conviction. He believes his Eighth Amendment right, the one preventing cruel and unusual punishment, was violated due to this mental deficiency, possibly caused by drug and alcohol abuse. However, the government objected to additional discovery regarding his mental health, stating that he was evaluated by 4 mental health professionals prior to his trial. Not only that, but 3 of these 4 professionals were obtained by Mikos and his attorneys. None of the experts suggested concern over his mental state and competency to stand trial. The court agreed that more discovery was warranted to determine if counsel did enough to determine Mikos' competency. They stated the discovery should focus on collateral information that would 1. Assist an expert in performing a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation of Mikos' to substantiate or disprove Dr. Rohn's diagnosis of bipolar disorder. 2. Help establish whether Mikos was suffering from this or any other diagnosable condition at the time of the trial. And 3. Determine if any condition could have affected his competency to stand trial. The third discovery Mikos' team put forward was the ballistics evidence presented. Mikos believed he was prejudiced by his inability to hire a qualified expert to challenge the government's ballistic analysts. The court responded by stating the government analysis did not result in any false or misleading testimony from its expert, FBI Special Agent Paul Tangren, who had simply stated the murder weapon could have been Mikos's. The court also reminded him that the defense had hired a ballistic expert. He just was not called to testify. The fourth discovery detail alleged Brady violations by the prosecution and requested a leave to issue 17 document requests and subpoenas and conduct 2 depositions. In this, Mikos was alleging that the government suppressed exculpatory and impeaching evidence. He went on to discuss a report about an interview with Elaine Rosenfield, the mother of Mikos' former girlfriend, Stacy Rosenfield. Mikos believed that in this report, Elaine said she thought something was wrong with Mikos mentally, and that the reality in his head was different from what was going on around him. According to Mikos, this somehow could have proved the government's theory that Mikos was a cold and calculating killer being wrong. The government dismissed these particular allegations as unfounded speculation and stated that Mikos did not provide sufficient evidence that the report even existed. They also stated the more obvious reason for the non-disclosure by the FBI. It did not provide any relevant information regarding the Medicare fraud or the murder of Joyce Brannon. However, the court did take issue with the FBI for conducting an interview of the grandmother of Mikos' children without informing his trial team, especially since she expressed relatively sympathetic views of Mikos. Therefore, the court directed the government to provide Mikos with a copy of the report. Finally, the fifth discovery was regarding racial and gender demographics of victims in federal capital cases. Mikos stated a higher percentage of cases involving white female victims are authorized to seek the death sentence in roughly 55% of the cases, compared with just 17% to 28% of the cases involving white male victims. The court concluded that Mikos' claims were unfounded, especially as he and his team did not raise the claim during the trial or on direct appeal. Additionally, the documents Mikos requested would have had no impact on the worth of his claim. The court also noted that the statistical evidence of racial disparities was not enough to prove that his sentence was imposed, quote, with discriminatory intent or in an unconstitutional manner. According to court documents, Mikos' grievances are directed at several agencies within the U.S. government, as well as several third parties that may have had information related to the litigation. Mikos' request for leave was granted in part and denied in part. The court stated that the parties are directed to meet and confer to craft a discovery plan consistent with the court's opinion and order. This matter is ongoing and was to be submitted to the court by October 5, 2024. At this point, the case against Mikos has lasted for over 2 decades. He is now 75 years old and is still awaiting execution in federal prison at a high-security U.S. penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He has been in prison for 22 years, but continues to find ways to try and get out of the death penalty sentence. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. To close out this episode, I just want to remind you all of the people who suffered at the hands of Dr. Ronald Mikos. He took advantage of the elderly patients entrusted to his care, tried to bully them into lying to the FBI in his defense, and committed a cruel, cold-blooded murder of the wonderful Joyce Brannon rather than facing the consequences of his own actions. Remember, he was being investigated for Medicare fraud. His actions, had he taken responsibility for them at the time of the investigation, would only have garnered him financial penalties, jail time, and likely the revocation of his medical license. But he still would have kept his freedom. He decided that those were worth the price of an innocent life. I have no sympathy for those who take part in elder abuse, and no doubt in my mind that he deserves to remain behind bars for the remainder of his life. Okay, listeners, thank you for joining me in this episode as we file away another true crime case. If you like our podcast, please review us on Apple Podcast or your podcast player of choice. It's a really big help. Follow us on social media. We're active on Twitter for now at truecrime_cases, Facebook at facebook.com/truecrimecaseswlaney, and Instagram at truecrimecaseswithlaney. Our website is truecrimecasespodcast.com, and you can follow me on Instagram at LaneyHobbsVO or on TikTok at LaneyHobbs. And we'd love to hear your episode suggestions. Send us an email, tcfcpod@gmail.com. This episode was researched and written by Rachel Spillers. She can be contacted at rachelspillersresearch@gmail.com and is a proud graduate of the True Crime Podcast Training Program. Editing and production assistance by Jesse Hawk of the Inky Paw Print. Audio engineering produced by the best in the business, Neeks at We Talk of Dreams. Check him out on Twitter at We Talk of Dreams or at theinkypawprint.com.